You ever wondered how many secrets a small town can bury before the truth claws its way back to the surface? Welcome to another journey into America's darkest hidden histories. Today we're traveling to the remote mountains of Tennessee, to a place called Hollow Creek, where in the freezing winter of 1931, a nightmare unfolded that would expose the rotting heart of an entire community. This is a story about power, silence, and the terrible price of looking the away. Before we start, tell us in the comments where you're watching from and if you've ever lived in a small town where everyone knew everyone's business, or thought they did. The Great Depression had America in a stranglehold by 1931. Banks were failing, factories were closing, and millions were out of work. But in the mountains of eastern Tennessee, life had always been hard, so the Depression was just another layer of suffering added to generations of struggle. People of Hollow Creek had learned long ago that survival meant keeping your head down, minding your business, and never, ever challenging those with power. Hollow Creek wasn't much to look at. A collection of maybe 40 houses scattered along a narrow valley, hemmed in by steep mountains on all sides. There was a general store that also served as the post office, a small Baptist church, and a one-room schoolhouse that served children from 6 surrounding communities. The nearest real town was Wartburg, about 12 miles away over roads that turned to impassable mud whenever it rained. Most families in Hollow Creek survived through a combination of subsistence farming, occasional work in the logging camps, and making moonshine. Prohibition was still the law of the land in 1931, and Tennessee's mountains were famous for their illegal whiskey operations. Every hollow had its stills. Every family had its recipe, and the law mostly looked the other way as long as you paid the right people. And that's where our story really begins. With the right people. With power and corruption and the silence that protects both. Robert Caldwell was the most powerful man in Hollow Creek and the surrounding area. He wasn't elected to anything, didn't hold any official position, but everyone knew that nothing happened in that part of Morgan County without his approval. Robert owned the general store, owned most of the land that families farmed as tenants, and most importantly, Robert controlled the moonshine trade. He was 52 years old in 1931, a big man with a voice that could fill a room and hands that had done violence when necessary. He had 2 sons who helped him run his various operations, Daniel and Michael, both in their late 20s, both cut from the same brutal cloth as their father. The Caldwells were the kind of family that everyone feared and no one crossed. Not if they valued their livelihood, their safety, or their lives. The county sheriff, a man named Ernest Palmer, was firmly in the Caldwell family's pocket. He had been for years. Palmer collected his regular payments, turned a blind eye to the moonshine operations, and made sure that anyone who caused problems for the Caldwells found themselves facing charges for something or other. It was a system that had worked smoothly for over a decade. Into this corrupt and carefully balanced world came a young woman named Anna Fletcher. She was 19 years old, the daughter of a struggling farmer named Thomas Fletcher who lived about 3 miles outside Hollow Creek proper. Anna was beautiful in that way that turns heads and causes trouble, with honey blonde hair, blue eyes, and a figure that drew attention no matter how modest her clothing. But Anna was more than just a pretty face. She was smart, literate, one of the few young people in the area who had actually finished school. She dreamed of leaving Hollow Creek, of going to Knoxville, or maybe even Nashville, of building a life beyond these suffocating mountains. She worked at Caldwell's general store, one of the few paying jobs available to women in the area, saving every penny she could toward her escape. Robert Caldwell's younger son, Michael, had taken an interest in Anna. He would come into the store when she was working, lean against the counter, make comments that started friendly but gradually became more personal, more insistent. Anna tried to handle it with polite deflection, but Michael wasn't the type to take hints. By November of 1931, Michael Caldwell had made it clear to multiple people that he intended to marry Anna Fletcher. The problem was, no one had bothered to ask Anna what she thought about this plan. And when Michael finally did ask her directly, in front of half a dozen customers at the store, Anna made a fatal mistake. She said no. store went silent. You could have heard a pin drop. No one said no to a Caldwell, ever. Especially not a poor farmer's daughter with no power, no protection, and no way to defend herself against the inevitable retaliation. Michael's face went red, then white. He stared at Anna for a long moment, then turned and walked out without another word. The customers quietly completed their purchases and left. Anna finished her shift, locked up the store, and walked home in the gathering dusk, knowing with absolute certainty that her life had just become exponentially more dangerous. She was right. Three days later, on November 18th, Anna disappeared. She had left home that morning to walk to the store for her shift. It was a journey she made 4 times a week, a 3-mile walk along a dirt road that wound through the forest. She never arrived. The store remained locked, and by noon, Robert Caldwell was asking where his employee was. Thomas Fletcher, Anna's father, was notified that afternoon. He immediately organized a search, gathering neighbors and friends to comb the route between his farm and Hollow Creek. They searched until dark, calling Anna's name, checking the woods on either side of the road, finding nothing. The search resumed at dawn the next day. By then, word had spread and more volunteers had joined. They expanded their search area, checking every abandoned cabin, every cave, every place a young woman might have taken shelter or been hidden. Sheriff Palmer was notified on the 3rd day. He arrived with his deputy, a young man named Carl Hodges, and made a show of taking the investigation seriously. He interviewed Thomas Fletcher, asked about Anna's habits and friends, whether she had a boyfriend, whether she might have run away. Fletcher insisted that Anna would never run away without telling him. They were close. He was a widower and she was his only child. She was planning to leave eventually, yes, but openly, with his blessing. Something had happened to her. Something bad. Palmer asked the question everyone was thinking, but no one wanted to voice. Had there been any trouble with the Caldwell family? The silence that followed was deafening. Finally, Fletcher quietly explained about Michael's proposal and Anna's rejection. Palmer's expression didn't change, but something in his eyes told Fletcher that this information was not welcome. The sheriff said he would look into all possibilities and left soon after. The search continued for 2 more weeks. Volunteers from surrounding communities joined the effort. They covered hundreds of acres of forest, checked every structure within a 5-mile radius, dragged parts of the creek that gave the community its name. They found absolutely nothing. By early December, most people had given up hope of finding Anna alive. The prevailing theory, the one Sheriff Palmer seemed to favor, was that Anna had been attacked by a wild animal, dragged off into the deep woods where her remains would likely never be found. Black bears were common in the area, though attacks on humans were rare. Still, it was a convenient explanation that required no uncomfortable questions about powerful families. But Thomas Fletcher didn't believe it. And neither did a handful of others who knew the Caldwell's reputation for dealing with problems permanently. Among those skeptics was a man named Samuel Morris. Samuel was 41 years old, a logger who had lived in Hollow Creek his entire life. He had his own reasons for hating the Caldwells. 5 years earlier, his younger brother had gotten into a dispute with Robert Caldwell over payment for timber. The brother had been found dead a week later, officially ruled a logging accident, though the circumstances were suspicious. Samuel had kept his mouth shut at the time, valuing his own life, but the rage had never left him. When Anna disappeared, Samuel started asking questions, quietly, carefully, but persistently. He talked to people who had been in the store that day when Anna rejected Michael. He asked what Michael's reaction had been, whether anyone had seen Michael in the days following. He tried to trace Anna's route on the morning she disappeared, looking for anyone who might have seen something. What Samuel discovered was a conspiracy of silence. People knew things, or suspected things, but no one would speak openly. The fear of the Caldwells ran too deep. But through careful questioning and reading between the lines, Samuel began to piece together a disturbing picture. Michael Caldwell had been seen on the road to the Fletcher farm on the morning Anna disappeared. Multiple people had noticed him riding past, heading in that direction around the time Anna would have been walking to work. But when Samuel tried to get anyone to confirm this to Sheriff Palmer, they suddenly developed amnesia. They weren't sure what day that was. Maybe it was a different morning. They couldn't swear to anything. Samuel also learned something else. The Caldwell family had a property about 4 miles from Hollow Creek, an old cabin that had belonged to Robert's father. It sat in a particularly isolated spot, accessible only by a rough trail that most people avoided. family rarely used it anymore, but Samuel heard whispers that Michael had been seen heading in that direction a few times recently. On December 15th, Samuel Morris made a decision that would cost him everything. He decided to investigate that cabin himself. He told no one where he was going. If the Caldwells were involved in Anna's disappearance, and if he found evidence at the cabin, he would need that evidence to be undeniable before he went to authorities. He knew Palmer wouldn't act on suspicions or accusations against the Caldwells without ironclad proof. Samuel waited until nightfall and made his way through the forest toward the old Caldwell cabin. It took him nearly 2 hours of difficult hiking in the dark. When he finally spotted the cabin through the trees, he saw dim light flickering in the windows. Someone was there. Samuel crept closer, moving carefully, avoiding branches that might snap and give away his presence. He reached a position behind a large oak tree about 30 yards from the cabin, close enough to observe, but hopefully far enough to remain undetected. What he saw through the cabin's dirty window would haunt him for the rest of his short life. Anna Fletcher was inside, alive, but clearly a prisoner. She was sitting on the floor in the corner, her hands apparently bound behind her back. Michael Caldwell was there too, pacing back and forth, drinking from a jar of moonshine. Samuel couldn't hear what was being said, but Michael's body language was aggressive, threatening. Samuel's first instinct was to rush the cabin to try to free Anna. But he was unarmed. Michael certainly wouldn't be. He needed help. He needed the law, even if it meant going to the corrupt Sheriff Palmer. With Anna alive and visible, even Palmer couldn't ignore this. Samuel began to carefully back away, intending to return to Hollow Creek and raise the alarm. He made it about 10 yards before he stepped on a dry branch. The crack seemed as loud as a gunshot in the quiet night. Inside the cabin, Michael's head snapped toward the window. Samuel froze, his heart pounding, hoping the darkness would conceal him. For a moment, nothing happened. Then the cabin door burst open, and Michael stepped out with a rifle in his hands. "Who's out there?" Michael called. "I know someone's there. Show yourself." Samuel remained perfectly still, barely breathing. Michael stood in the doorway for a long moment, scanning the darkness. Then he raised the rifle to his shoulder and fired 3 times in Samuel's general direction. Samuel felt a tremendous impact in his chest and fell backward. He tried to draw breath but couldn't. Blood filled his mouth. As his vision began to fade, he saw Michael approaching with a lantern, saw the realization on the younger man's face when he recognized who he'd shot. "God damn it," Michael muttered. "God damn it all to hell." Those were the last words Samuel Morris heard. Michael dragged Samuel's body into the cabin. Anna screamed when she saw it, a sound that Michael silenced with a vicious backhand. He stood there for a moment, thinking, calculating. He had a problem now. 2 problems. Samuel Morris was well known, and when he disappeared, people would ask questions. Maybe not enough questions to challenge the Caldwells directly, but questions nonetheless. Michael made a decision. He would have to tell his father and brother. This was too big to handle alone. He tied a gag around Anna's mouth, checked that her bonds were secure, and left the cabin, carefully locking it behind him. He rode through the night back to Hollow Creek, arriving at his father's house around 3 a.m. Robert Caldwell was not happy to be woken, and he was even less happy when he heard what Michael had done. This had been a simple situation that could have been handled cleanly, quietly. Now there was a body, a witness, and a mess that required serious management. Robert, Michael, and Daniel Caldwell had a family meeting that lasted until dawn. By the time the sun rose on December 16th, they had a plan. It was brutal, it was ruthless, but it would solve their problems permanently. The 3 Caldwell men returned to the cabin that morning. Anna Fletcher, who had spent the night in terror beside Samuel Morris's corpse, knew immediately when she saw their faces that she was never leaving that cabin alive. What happened next was so horrific that even decades later, people who learned the details wished they hadn't. Anna was murdered slowly and with deliberate cruelty. The Caldwells wanted to send a message to anyone else who might consider defying them or interfering in their business. When they were done, they dealt with both bodies. Samuel and Anna were buried in the woods about a mile from the cabin, their graves dug deep and carefully concealed. The cabin was thoroughly cleaned, all evidence of what had occurred erased as best as possible. Then the Caldwells went home and went about their business as if nothing had happened. Samuel Morris's disappearance was noticed immediately. His wife, Martha, reported him missing when he didn't come home. Sheriff Palmer investigated with his usual lack of enthusiasm, concluding that Samuel had probably gone off on a drunk and would turn up eventually. But Samuel's friends and family knew he rarely drank and never disappeared without warning. Martha was certain something had happened to him. She connected his disappearance with his questions about Anna Fletcher. She tried to tell Palmer about Samuel's suspicions regarding the Caldwells, but the sheriff cut her off. "Martha, I know you're worried, but you need to be careful about making accusations," Palmer said. "The Caldwell family are respected members of this community. You can't go around suggesting they're involved in crimes without evidence." "It was a threat, thinly veiled." Martha understood. She stopped pushing, but she didn't stop wondering. Christmas came and went. The community of Hollow Creek tried to find some joy in the season, but 2 disappearances had cast a shadow over everything. Thomas Fletcher sat alone in his farmhouse, knowing his daughter was dead but having no way to prove it, no way to get justice. Martha Morris cared for her 3 children and tried to explain why their father hadn't come home. And the Caldwell family celebrated, secure in their power, confident that fear would keep everyone silent. But they had made a mistake. A small one, but in the end it would prove fatal. The old Caldwell cabin had a neighbor of sorts. About a mile away, over the ridge, lived a hermit named Elijah Stone. Elijah was 67 years old, a recluse who lived alone in a shack, surviving by hunting, fishing, and tending a small garden. He had lived in those mountains for 40 years and knew every trail, every ridge, every hidden valley. On the night of December 15th, Elijah had heard gunshots. That wasn't unusual in itself. People hunted at night sometimes, or shot at predators threatening their livestock. But something about these shots bothered him. They came from the direction of the old Caldwell cabin, and Elijah knew the Caldwells. He had reason to distrust them. The next day, Elijah decided to investigate. He made his way through the woods to a vantage point overlooking the cabin and watched. He saw 3 men arrive, recognized them as the Caldwell men. He watched them enter the cabin, heard screams from inside that made his blood run cold, then watched them leave hours later, their clothes stained with what could only be blood. Elijah followed them, keeping his distance, using all his woodsman skills to remain undetected. He watched them go to a spot about a mile from the cabin. He watched them dig. He understood what he was witnessing. For days, Elijah struggled with what to do. He was just one old man against the most powerful family in the area. If he went to Sheriff Palmer, nothing would happen except Elijah would likely have an accident. But 2 people were dead, and their families deserved to know. Finally, Elijah made a decision. He would go over Palmer's head. He would go to the state authorities. On January 5th, 1932, Elijah Stone walked the 12 miles to Wartburg. He found the office of the district attorney, a man named Charles Morrison who had a reputation for integrity. Elijah told his story, described what he had seen and heard, and offered to lead investigators to the graves. Morrison listened carefully. He had heard rumors about the Caldwells, about Sheriff Palmer's corruption, about the atmosphere of fear in Hollow Creek. But rumors weren't evidence. What Elijah was offering was evidence. Morrison contacted the Tennessee Bureau of Investigation. Within 2 days, a team of state investigators arrived in Morgan County. They included Agent Thomas Blackburn, a 15-year veteran known for his dogged pursuit of cases and his unwillingness to be intimidated. On January 8th, the convoy of vehicles made their way to Hollow Creek. Sheriff Palmer was notified that state agents were taking over the investigation into the disappearances of Anna Fletcher and Samuel Morris. Palmer protested, claimed the state was overstepping, but he had no real authority to stop them. Elijah Stone led Agent Blackburn and his team to the old Caldwell cabin. They searched it thoroughly, finding trace evidence that the Caldwells had missed in their cleaning. Bloodstains that had seeped between floorboards. A woman's hair ribbon caught in a crack in the wall. A button torn from Samuel Morris's shirt. Then Elijah led them to the graves. The team dug carefully, documenting everything. About 3 feet down, they uncovered the first body. Samuel Morris, identified by his clothing and a distinctive scar on his forearm. 3 gunshot wounds to the chest. Beside Samuel's body, they found Anna Fletcher. What had been done to her before her death was so savage that the seasoned investigators had to step away, overcome by rage and grief. Dr. Firstachet. Benjamin Cole, the medical examiner brought from Knoxville, documented injuries that told a story of prolonged torture and sexual violence. Warrants were immediately issued for Robert, Daniel, and Michael Caldwell. Agent Blackburn personally led the arrest team to the Caldwell house in Hollow Creek. It was mid-afternoon on January 9th. The Caldwells were all home when the agents arrived. Robert came to the door with his usual arrogance, demanding to know what this was about. Blackburn informed him that all 3 Caldwell men were under arrest for the murders of Anna Fletcher and Samuel Morris. Robert laughed. "You can't arrest us," he said. "Sheriff Palmer will straighten this out." "Sheriff Palmer is also under arrest," Blackburn replied, "for obstruction of justice and accessory after the fact. Now, are you coming quietly, or do we do this the hard way?" The realization that their protection was gone, that real consequences were coming, hit the Caldwells simultaneously. Michael actually tried to run, bolting out the back door. He made it about 20 yards before 2 agents tackled him. Daniel reached for a rifle, but 3 agents had guns on him before he could raise it. Robert just stood there, his face going pale as he understood that his world had just collapsed. All 3 were taken into custody and transported to Knoxville. Sheriff Palmer was arrested at his office, stunned and protesting that he'd done nothing wrong, that he was just doing his job. His protests fell on deaf ears. The trial began on March 14, 1932. It was held in Knoxville rather than Morgan County. Too much local influence, too much intimidation. The courthouse was packed every day with spectators, journalists, and the victims' families. The prosecution, led by District Attorney Morrison himself, built an overwhelming case. They had physical evidence from the cabin and the graves. They had Elijah Stone's eyewitness testimony. They had the medical examiner's brutal documentation of what had been done to Anna and Samuel. The defense tried to argue that the state's case was circumstantial, that Elijah Stone was a confused old man whose testimony couldn't be trusted, that the evidence had been planted, but it was hopeless. The jury saw through every argument. Thomas Fletcher sat in the courtroom every day, listening to what had been done to his daughter, tears streaming down his face. Martha Morris was there too, her children left with family, determined to see justice for her husband. On March 28th, after 4 days of deliberation, the jury returned guilty verdicts on all counts for all 3 Caldwell men. First-degree murder, kidnapping, additional charges that ensured they would never see freedom again. The judge, a stern man named Harold Whitmore, showed no mercy in sentencing. He gave each of the Caldwells life in prison with no possibility of parole. He added that if Tennessee had allowed it, he would have sentenced them to death. "You 3 men represent the worst kind of evil," Judge Whitmore said. "You used your power to prey on the innocent, to silence opposition, to destroy anyone who stood in your way. You corrupted the very institutions meant to protect people from men like you. I hope you live long lives in prison, with nothing but your conscience and your crimes for company." Sheriff Ernest Palmer was tried separately. He was convicted of corruption, obstruction of justice, and accessory after the fact to murder. He received 20 years in prison. His career, his reputation, everything he'd built through years of corruption, destroyed. Robert Caldwell died in prison in 1947, killed in a fight with another inmate. Daniel died in 1958 of heart disease. Michael lived until 1971, spending 39 years behind bars before dying of cancer. None of them ever expressed remorse for what they'd done. The community of Hollow Creek was forever changed by the trial and its revelations. The extent of the Caldwells' crimes, the years of intimidation and violence, the complete corruption of local law enforcement, all of it became public knowledge. People who had kept silent for years finally felt safe enough to speak. Other crimes came to light, other victims, other families who had suffered in silence. Thomas Fletcher never recovered from Anna's death. He lived alone on his farm for another 12 years, becoming increasingly reclusive. until he died of pneumonia in 1944. The farm was sold and the money went to a small scholarship fund for young women from Morgan County, a small attempt to create something good from such tragedy. Martha Morris remarried in 1938, finding some measure of happiness with a good man who helped her raise Samuel's children. She lived until 1979, long enough to see her grandchildren grown. She never spoke publicly about what happened to Samuel, but privately she told her family that she hoped he knew justice had finally been served. Elijah Stone, the hermit whose courage brought the truth to light, became something of a local legend. He continued living alone in his mountain shack until his death in 1949 at age 84. The community took care of him in his final years, bringing him food and supplies, showing their gratitude in the ways mountain people do, through actions rather than words. The old Caldwell cabin was burned to the ground shortly after the trial. No one wanted it standing, a monument to evil. The land was eventually sold to the state and is now part of a nature preserve. If you know where to look, you can still find the foundation stones, slowly being reclaimed by the forest. The case changed how Tennessee handled corruption in rural counties. New oversight mechanisms were put in place. State investigators were given more authority to intervene when local law enforcement was compromised. It wasn't perfect, corruption never completely goes away, but it was better. More importantly, the trial sent a message that power and intimidation couldn't guarantee immunity. That even in the most remote communities, even against the most powerful families, justice could still be served. It just required someone brave enough to speak up. Anna Fletcher and Samuel Morris are buried side by side in the Hollow Creek Cemetery. Their graves are simple, marked with modest headstones, but they're never without flowers. The community remembers. The community honors their memory by refusing to forget what happened, by teaching each generation about the importance of standing up to evil, even when it seems unstoppable. If you found this story powerful, if it reminded you that silence in the face of evil is itself a form of evil, then please subscribe and share this video. These stories matter. These victims matter. Their names deserve to be remembered. And comment below. Have you ever witnessed injustice and struggled with whether to speak up? In small communities where everyone knows everyone, how do we find the courage to challenge those with power? These are questions every generation must answer. Rest in peace, Anna Fletcher and Samuel Morris. Your story will not be forgotten.